All right, so in this chapter, we're going to cover interpersonal conflict and how conflicts emerge in relationships and interpersonal contexts, and how we basically navigate and negotiate different types of conflicts in different types of settings. So, first, we should define what interpersonal conflict actually is because there's some uniqueness to it that makes it a little different from just any type of conflict. Interpersonal conflict, it's an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from the other party in achieving those goals. And to break down that definition a little bit more, there's some important things to remember with this definition, and this will likely come up on some sort of quiz or test. Um, First off, it's an express struggle. Basically, what's key to this is it's not conflict until it is known. So until you actually express it, until you share it with somebody else, it's not considered an interpersonal conflict. So you may be having some kind of personal conflict. There might be something that you're stressing over, or you might view as a conflict in your relationship, but it's not actually considered an interpersonal conflict until you express that and both parties know that it's a conflict at hand. It occurs between two or more interdependent parties, meaning that it's not considered an interpersonal conflict that the two parties don't rely on each other somehow. So if you're just irritated or upset with somebody, that's not the same as being in a situation where you're struggling or upset with somebody when you rely on them or you somehow depend on them. So it needs to have two parties that rely on each other in some capacity in order for it to be considered an interpersonal conflict. It is about goals that the parties perceive to be incompatible. It can't satisfy both parties' needs, meaning there's some perception that in order for this to be accomplished, we're both not going to get exactly what we want out of it. It arises over perceived scarce resources such as time or money, and also it includes interference. It interferes with your goals somehow. Whatever you're trying to accomplish in an interpersonal context, an interpersonal conflict is going to interfere with you completing or reaching your goals in some capacity. So, in relationships, conflict, it's important to remember this is natural. Any kind of relationship you have, whether it's a professional relationship, a friendship, a romantic relationship, there's always going to be conflict. And it's not something that you necessarily need to run away from or be scared of. It's a natural thing that's bound to happen. It has content, meaning there are specific topics at hand. It's relational, and what that basically gets at is what does the conflict mean for the relationship? And it's procedural. It has all these three different dimensions, and procedural refers to rules on engaging in the conflict. There's basically a content. There's always content to a conflict, relational meanings to a conflict, and then procedural dimensions to a conflict. An example is this would be like some individuals solve by yelling, and you solve conflict by avoiding. This has completely different procedures on how these individuals basically engage in conflict. It can be direct or indirect, meaning it can be I'm upset with you about blank, so let's talk. That would kind of be directly addressing what the conflict is and wanting to, basically fix it. Indirect way of handling a conflict is if I'm gonna flirt with other ladies to get your attention. So in this situation, it could be like a romantic couple, and the way to handle it directly would be, just basically address them and say, let's talk. Indirectly is again kind of taking that passive aggressive route to kind of get their attention instead of directly talking about the problem. It can be harmful, both psychologically, physically, through abuse, but it also can be beneficial. It can soften an issue before it becomes huge. It allows individuals to kind of take each other's perspective, and more tactful and competent communication skills can be developed if you successfully navigate through any type of conflict. So power also plays a big role with conflict, and conflict occurs between two parties, typically with unequal power. Power is the ability to manipulate or influence or control other people and events, and there's a variety of characteristics associated with power. It's context specific, meaning depending on what situation you are in, what context you are in, different people hold different types of power, and we'll talk about the different types of power here in a moment. Power is always present, regardless of what situation you're in, what context you're in, what conversation you're having. There's always a component of power in some way, shape, or form. Power influences communication, meaning we can do one up where we decide, to basically, look for somebody's perspective and respect them. We can one down somebody where we're talking down to people, and one across is kind of more of a neutral approach. Um, Power can be positive or negative. Power can be used in very good ways to influence people in very positive ways, or we can use power in very negative ways to belittle people and kind of control people. And power and conflict work hand in hand. They both influence each other. Power influences conflict, and conflict influences power. So there's different types of power that take place in conflict. Um, First, you have reward power. This is the ability to give gifts. So this is if your employer can grant you, more time off or increase your pay or something like that. That's a type of power. Coercive power is the opposite of that. This is where you have the ability to punish or take things away. Referent power just basically refers to people that are likable. The fact that you can be a likable individual and people are drawn to you is a form of power. Legitimate power is your title or status. This is your manager or somebody at work that has some kind of title like that. And expert power, finally, is basically the amount of knowledge that you have can be viewed as power. If you're an expert on a particular topic, that kind of gives you the power in that interpersonal situation when talking about that topic or negotiating about that topic. Sex, gender, culture, and power, these things all intermingle. Unfortunately, we live in a society that favors patriarchy, meaning favors men and families, organizations, and government. Men usually, are expected to or viewed as kind of dominant. And again, this isn't really a good thing. It's unfortunate that there are so many gender inequalities across the world, especially in the United States. But several nations are starting to kind of change this up a little bit. And we're starting to see a social shift where there actually are females in power in those big positions, making those big contributions and decisions, so on and so forth. One part that relates to this is a theory called principle of least interest in relationships. And basically what this gets at is the one who has less invested in the relationship has more power. The person that shows the least amount of interest has a lot more power. The individual that's always trying to please the other one, always trying to fix everything, always trying to, basically please the other individual, they have less power in a relationship. And if you think of your interpersonal relationships, or if you've ever been in a romantic relationship where the other person liked you a lot more than you liked them, you could kind of do whatever you want. You didn't really care about making decisions as much. You didn't really care about the repercussions or consequences associated with those types of things as much as the individual that has the least power does. And then culture and power, we talked about this earlier on, but always keep in mind that different cultures have different ideas of power distance in terms of your status influencing who you can communicate with, who you can be friends with, so on and so forth. So how do we manage interpersonal conflict? We can basically the way that we handle conflict determines if it's positive or negative. We have a lot of problematic behaviors like criticism, where we just start criticizing the other person. Contempt is where you start actually attacking a partner's self-worth. Instead of focusing on the topic and discussing the topic that's causing the conflict, you just kind of attack them and their character and call them dumb, call them stupid, whatever it might be. Defensiveness is when, instead of trying to address the topic and fix the conflict, you just kind of play the role of the victim. And it's just like, poor me, I'm always wrong, I'm always this, I'm always that, you're always telling me this, instead of actually addressing the problem. And then stonewalling is basically where you just shut down. You don't talk about it, you don't really respond to it, you just completely avoid it at all costs. And all these approaches are considered problematic behaviors. They're unproductive, they don't really solve the conflict, they don't really help you in your interpersonal relationships, they just do not help you with any sort of interpersonal conflict. This conflict management style grid kind of shows the different types when it comes to successful management of conflict. On the left-hand side here, you can see that there's an axis that's focused on cares about yourself, where it's you highly care about yourself in the top left, and you have a low care about yourself in the lower left. And then on the other axis here, you have care about others from low to high. So basically read this in your textbook and you can get an idea of this. If you have a high care about yourself, but a low care about the other person, you're going to be a competitor when it comes to managing conflict. You're going to want to win. You're going to want to win the argument, and you're going to want the conflict to play out in your favor regardless of the other person's feelings. If you're an avoider, it means you have a low care for yourself and you have a low care about the other person. You're not trying to get anything out of resolving the conflict, and you don't really care what the other person gets out of conflict if you are to resolve it. Collaborating is considered a really good one. This is where you have a high concern of self and high concern of others. So whenever a conflict arises, you want the best outcome for both you and the other person in the conflict. Accommodating, on the other hand, is where you kind of are focused on the other person. You just want the other person to be happy. You want them to be okay and come out of this all right. You don't really care about yourself. Compromising is put in the middle here, and it's usually the best approach where you try to just be comparable to everybody. You care about yourself, but not too much. You care about the others, but not too much, and you try to make that compromise so that each individual is getting a little bit out of it. You're kind of meeting in the middle, and that's literally why it's in the middle of the grid. So just know these different conflict management styles, know these spectrums, know these axes, the X and Y axis, and be able to kind of plug in this chart and know where each one goes. But understand it's all about how highly you care about yourself and how highly you care about others. And this really determines a lot with how we resolve and handle conflict.